The risk is that people get drawn into things which spiral out of control. So that's why the focus of diplomacy has to be on trying to control and contain the situation.
Is it a case that we are now facing a tipping point in the escalation of the conflict? The last 8 days have seen airstrikes, assassinations, and last night around 50 rockets were fired from Lebanon into northern Israel by Hezbollah. Reportedly, all were intercepted by the Iron Dome defence system, but few expect Israel to allow its enemies the final word. And both the US and UK governments have now urged their citizens to leave Lebanon immediately, warning the situation could deteriorate rapidly. What happens next and how the UK should respond? I'm joined by Sir Simon Fraser, Permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 2010 to 2015. He's the perfect person to guide us through this story. Good afternoon, Sir Simon. And please can I just start by asking you, is this a tipping point in this conflict?
Well, hello, good afternoon, Theo. I don't know, but it's clearly a point of very high tension and risk. We've been seeing the risk of escalation for some time now. There was a spike, you may recall, in April when there was a standoff, an exchange of actions between Iran and Israel. And since then, of course, as you say, recently, we've had these two apparent assassinations, one of which Israel has claimed, and Iran has vowed that there will be a response against that. You mentioned the Hezbollah rockets last night. Actually, that's not something that's new. There have been rockets and exchanges between Hezbollah and the Israelis for quite a long time, since, in fact, the Gaza crisis started. So that may not in itself be the escalation, but the risk of escalation remains.
What are the effects if there is a long-term and significant war between Israel and Lebanon and or Iran? What would be the effects here in Britain in terms of prices potentially, an oil crisis, destabilisation in the region that is the Middle East?
I mean, first of all, I hope it can be avoided because the consequences will be very serious. First of all, and mainly in the region itself, for Israel, for the countries around Israel. It's a tinderbox, the whole region, and the risk is that people get drawn into things which spiral out of control. So that's why the focus of diplomacy has to be on trying to control and contain the situation. If it does escalate, it could do it in a number of ways. For example, one of the interesting things would be whether it is limited to something between Hezbollah and Israel in the south of Lebanon and north of Israel, or whether Iran becomes directly drawn in through direct action against Israel. That is quite a different type of escalation, and it would signal a different set of risks. As you say, there are big risks for the rest of the world. There are two real fundamental ones for, say, the British. First of all, there is the consular risk for British people in the region. As you know, the British government has already been asking people to leave Lebanon, so clearly they're very concerned about that risk. And then, of course, there are the wider security and economic and political risks. You mentioned oil prices. There is this issue of shipping in the Gulf, which is already under threat because of the actions of the Houthis in Yemen. So there are sort of spin-off economic risks which would definitely flow.
And how severe, just on those spin-off risks in particular that you mentioned there, so Simon, how severe could those be?
Well, the disruption of shipping is already quite severe in the region. It's not actually hugely affecting global trade, but it is a significant factor. Obviously, oil prices and liquid gas from the Gulf, they are very sensitive and very important for the global economy. The global economy's dependence on Middle East oil is less now than it used to be, but it's still very important. And it's not just oil, it's gas as well. So those are very important things. And then, of course, beyond that, there are, for example, a number of American military bases. There are a lot of American military personnel in the region. If they were to be drawn in directly, that again raises the stakes quite dramatically to a further level.
Just moving on to other events in the last 7 days, and of course that US-Russia prisoner swap deal, which thankfully brought Evan Gershkovich back to his family and, of course, his colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. But when I was speaking to John Bolton, who, of course, was Donald Trump's national security advisor, he warned that by doing this deal, the US had potentially put a price on US nationals abroad for dictatorships. Is that something? Is that an appraisal, an assessment that you recognise?
I mean, it is a concern. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that you never quite know the whole story with these sorts of deals. You never quite know what's gone on behind the scenes. This was obviously a major, very carefully orchestrated agreement involving a number of countries, notably the Americans and the Germans, and involved a lot of people as well. So it was quite a significant diplomatic achievement by the United States. But of course, as you say, the risk is that you are appearing to encourage this behavior of effectively hostage taking by President Putin, so that he can trade what we now are clear was at least one state assassin who was traded back in this exchange. And that is a risk. So you have to weigh this very carefully. I don't think there's any absolute right answer.
Well, sometimes it's a risk worth taking, no?
Well, it's a risk. I think in this case, it's a risk worth taking. These are very high-profile people who've come back, and not only was it the American citizens who were released, but a number of Russian activist opponents of Putin were released as well. So it's a risk worth taking. I think that's what the American administration obviously concluded, but it's certainly a risk of encouraging similar behaviours in the future.
Just lastly, and while you're joining us on Times Radio, and I hope you won't mind me asking, but when I did my research, I read an article which touted you as potentially a future ambassador to Washington for the UK, a choice pick for Keir Starmer potentially. Is that a job that you would like to do?
Well, I know the story came up. It hasn't actually been in circulation recently, so I thought it might have gone away. I don't know where. I don't
mean to cause embarrassment.
I don't know where it came up. Obviously, it's a great job, and I hope the government picks a person who's effectively able to represent British interests in the United States, whoever is the president there. It's an incredibly important position.
Could that be you?
I don't think it's likely to be me. Nobody certainly talked to me about it. I think the important thing is the government waits, sees who wins the election, and then decides on the best person to promote our interests there.
So, Simon Fraser, I really appreciate your time this afternoon. Have a lovely Sunday.